The twin suns burned high above the black stone arena, casting long shadows over the jagged walls that echoed with screams, cheers, and roars of 100 alien species. The ground trembled with the sound of drums and the scent of sweat, blood, and fear filled the air like thick smoke. At the center of the arena stood a figure so large, so battle-worn, that even monsters hesitated before facing him. His body was carved with scars from wars that happened centuries ago. His eyes burned with something older than rage, and his breath came slow like a storm waiting to break. His name was Kraith, and his legend had reached the edge of every known galaxy. Some called him the Bonebreaker, others whispered his true title, the God of Sand, for in this very arena, beneath these very suns, no soul had ever defeated him. No one had even made him bleed. Alien champions from every empire had stepped into this ring, some with 6 arms, some with living armor, some carrying blades made from stars. Yet all of them had fallen before Kraith like dry leaves under a meteor strike. The arena had never known mercy, and Kraith had never shown any. Today the crowd was louder than ever. Warriors from all across the stars had come to witness the next challenger. Many expected another swift execution, another pile of bones added to the sand. But something felt different in the air, something even the wind couldn't explain. The Emperor himself was present, sitting high above the ring in his floating obsidian throne, his many eyes watching like a spider before a feast. Beside him stood his royal announcer, trembling as he read the parchment with the name of the next challenger. When the name echoed across the arena, the crowd fell silent for a moment, then laughter exploded like thunder. A human, they said. A human would challenge Kraith, the Bonebreaker. The very idea was madness. Humans were soft, small, breakable. Why would one ever walk willingly to their death? But the laughter did not last long, for the arena gate groaned open with a sound like metal dying. And out stepped a figure wrapped in dust and light. He was not tall, not armored, not even armed. He wore simple worn clothes, his chest bare, and his eyes calm like still water before a quake. Kraith squinted as the human walked toward him, not with arrogance but with stillness, like the air before lightning strikes. There was something wrong, something off. Kraith's heart, which hadn't raced in a century, thumped once with unease. The crowd began to boo, throwing scraps and bones into the sand, demanding action, screaming for blood. But the human did not flinch. He kept walking until he stood a few feet from Kraith, his eyes fixed on the champion like he was looking into a mirror from the future. Kraith spoke first, his voice deep like mountains crumbling. "You are no warrior," he growled. "You are no threat. You are just a man who forgot what fear smells like." The human said nothing. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared as if measuring the weight of Kraith's soul. The Emperor leaned forward, curious now. One of his guards whispered that the human had no known records, no family, no history. He had simply appeared at the trial gates, passed all tests without speaking a word, and demanded to face Kraith without delay. Kraith raised his massive axe, the blade covered in dried blood from battles older than the crowd itself. The ground cracked as he stepped forward. But then, just as he prepared to swing, the human spoke. One word, just one, and everything changed. The sound was soft, but Kraith heard it like a scream in his mind. His hands trembled for the first time in centuries. The axe felt heavier, his vision blurred, and an ancient memory clawed its way back into his skull. A battlefield long forgotten, a voice from the past, a scar hidden beneath his skin. The crowd grew restless. They didn't hear the word, but they saw the change. Kraith's stance shifted. His jaw tightened. His eyes widened with something no one ever thought he could feel: fear. The Emperor sat up in his throne, his many eyes narrowing. He barked an order to the announcer, but even his voice felt distant now, drowned by the weight of what had just happened. Kraith stepped back, one step. The entire arena gasped as one. The Bonebreaker had never taken a step back. The human still stood calm, his arms at his sides, no weapon, no shield. Just silence and a presence that felt heavier than any blade Kraith had ever faced. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Kraith's mind raced. The word the human spoke was not just a word. It was a name he had buried deep inside, a name that should not exist anymore. A name that once belonged to a warrior who had nearly ended Kraith's life long ago. And that warrior had been human too. The sands beneath Kraith's feet felt colder now. The sun's dimmer, the crowd louder but meaningless. Only one thing mattered. The man before him was not just another fighter. He was a message from the past. A ghost walking in flesh. A warning that history was not done with him yet. The human tilted his head slightly, as if waiting for Kraith to remember everything. As if giving him a chance to choose fight and fall, or surrender and survive. And for the first time in his life, Kraith hesitated. The Emperor's voice echoed again, louder now, demanding blood, demanding violence. But the arena no longer listened. To him, they were watching something bigger than a fight. They were witnessing the beginning of a story that would echo through time like thunder rolling across a dead world. And the human finally took one step closer. Kraith did not move, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't dare. The sun still burned above the arena, but now their heat felt distant, like the warmth of a memory slowly fading away, and the crowd that once roared with bloodlust had grown quiet, watching something they did not understand unfold before their eyes. The human stood in the center of the ring, his body relaxed, his shoulders lowered, his breath steady, like he had done this 1,000 times before, like he belonged here. Not as prey, but as something far older, far deeper than a challenger. Kraith the Bonebreaker, the undefeated monster of the arena, stared at the man like he was staring at the edge of the universe, his axe still in hand, but his fingers had started to twitch. Not from excitement, but from confusion and something worse, fear. The Emperor above clenched the edge of his obsidian throne, his lips moving silently, his many eyes twitching as he stared at the human, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, because no one had ever made Kraith hesitate, and yet this human had done it without lifting a finger. The crowd shifted uneasily, unsure whether to laugh or scream, unsure whether this was comedy or war. But even the most savage in the front rows could feel it. Now this was not just a battle, this was something ancient waking up, something buried coming to the surface again. The human's name was still unknown, no banner, no title, no history had been given, and yet every step he took left a trail in the minds of the watchers, like smoke carving symbols into the wind, symbols they didn't recognize, but couldn't forget. Kraith finally growled, not a roar of rage, but a sound like chains breaking deep in his chest. He raised his axe higher, letting the sunlight catch its jagged edge, as if reminding the human of the fate he had signed up for. But the human didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe faster. "You dare stand before me with nothing in your hands, no armor, no blade, no shield," Kraith snarled, his voice cracking the air like thunder. "Do you think this is some kind of ceremony? Do you think I will show mercy because of your weakness?" Still the human did not speak, not a word, not a whisper, just a soft blink and a small tilt of the head, as if he was waiting for Kraith to finish, waiting for the lie to unravel on its own. The Emperor slammed his fist down, sending a vibration through the floating platform. The arena gates behind the human groaned as they sealed shut and flames burst from the edge of the ring, caging them and forcing the fight to begin now or never. Kraith could feel his muscles tighten, his instincts screaming to move, to attack, to crush, but the human silence was a wall, a force that made even his blood hesitate. Something about the calmness in those human eyes reminded Kraith of things he had locked away behind scars and victories. Suddenly, the human took one slow step forward, and another, each footfall soft, but heavier than any war drum, and Kraith could hear it now, not just sound, but something under the sound, a rhythm, a pulse like a forgotten heartbeat rising. From the dust, the crowd leaned forward, the tension so thick it pressed against their chests like armor. They didn't choose to wear. Their shouts died before they could be spoken, and even the Emperor's guards had stopped moving, their hands twitching near their weapons, unsure what they might need them for. Kraith swung his axe, not in rage, but in warning, a slash that tore through the air with speed, meant to kill mountains, but it landed on empty sand. The human had moved. Not quickly, not desperately, just enough like he knew where the blade would be. Before it got there, the crowd gasped as the sand settled. The human standing behind Kraith, untouched, unmoved, unbothered, his eyes still locked on the champion, like he was looking through him, not at him, like he could see something no one else could. Kraith turned slowly, sweat now dripping down his back, not from the heat, but from something colder. The human reminded him of a night long ago, when he had bled for the first time, when his bones had cracked, and he had screamed into the stars begging them not to let him die. He had been younger, then arrogant and full of fire, and the warrior who broke him had been quiet like this. Human, just as still, just as strange. And when Kraith had survived by crawling from that battlefield, he had sworn to forget that day, to erase the shame and replace it with victories. But now that memory was walking again, and Kraith couldn't stop it from breathing through the man in front of him. He couldn't stop the weight of truth pressing down harder than gravity itself. "Who are you?" Kraith asked, his voice no longer loud, no longer mocking, but filled with something dangerous, curiosity. The human did not answer. Instead, he reached behind his neck and pulled down the collar of his shirt, revealing a scar not made by war, not by weapon, but by branding. The mark was circular, glowing faintly blue like frost made of light, and Kraith stepped back because he had seen that symbol once before, burned into the skin of the only creature that had ever brought him to his knees. The crowd didn't understand the symbol, but the Emperor did, and his face twisted, not in confusion, but in horror. His voice cracked as he whispered to his guard, "That symbol is not supposed to exist anymore. We wiped them all out. We burned every record, every child, every trace." The human finally spoke, his voice soft but sharp like glass. "Breaking underwater, you burned lies into your history. You buried truth beneath your throne, but now it is walking again. Now it is standing before your champion, and it remembers everything." Kraith's grip loosened, his axe hanging now like dead weight in his hands, and the air grew colder as the human took another step and another, and the light from the twin suns seemed to dim behind him, as if the sky itself was leaning closer to listen. "You know who I am now," the human said, not as a question, but as a fact, and Kraith nodded once, slow and heavy, like a mountain accepting defeat before the storm even hits the ground. "Then kneel," the human said, and silence fell so thick even the fire around the arena stopped moving. Kraith dropped to one knee, the sand catching the fall of a legend, and the crowd screamed, not in anger, not in disbelief, but in fear, for they had just watched their god surrender to a ghost. And the Emperor stood from his throne with fury in his eyes, because he knew this was no longer a fight. This was the beginning of something they could not control, something older than war and louder than death itself. And the human turned his head, slowly toward him, eyes glowing faintly with the light of something long thought extinct, and said, "I am not here to win, I am here to end it all." The moment Kraith's knee touched the sand, the arena became a graveyard of sound. The crowd, frozen in their seats, their voices caught in their throats, their minds unable to process what they had just witnessed, because this had never happened, not here, not ever. The Bonebreaker had bowed not to a beast, not to a king, but to a human who had no weapon, no armor, no name. Just a whisper and a scar that glowed like forgotten fire beneath his skin, and that whisper still echoed inside Kraith's skull, tearing through his memories like a blade of truth. The Emperor stood stiffly above the arena, his many eyes wide, his mouth trembling with words he dared not say because he too had heard the whisper, not with his ears, but with his soul, and it had cracked something deep inside him that had stayed buried for decades. That name the human spoke was not just a sound. It was a ghost, a blade, a storm wrapped in memory. It was the name of a warrior who once stood in the same arena, not as a challenger, but as a warning, and the Emperor had ordered him erased, wiped from the archives, scorched from every system, and now his blood had returned to finish what he started. Kraith kept his head low, not from shame, but from something more ancient than defeat. He had not surrendered because he was afraid of dying. He had surrendered because he remembered what dying had almost felt like when he faced the one who came before, and this one was stronger. This one was colder. This one had purpose. The human turned away from Kraith, slowly, his eyes lifting toward the Emperor, and in that gaze the Emperor felt the weight of every lie he had ever spoken, every secret he had ever buried, pressing down on him like gravity with no mercy. "Who is he?" Someone in the crowd whispered, their voice trembling like a leaf in poison. "Wind, who's that human? What did he say to make?" Kraith kneeled, and no one answered because no one knew, and those who might have known were already pretending they didn't exist. The Emperor gestured sharply, his voice snapping like a whip across the silence. "Bring in the next challenger." He screamed, his voice filled with desperation. The crowd must forget this moment, make them forget, distract them, drown this in blood and fire and steel. But the guards hesitated, even they felt it now, the pull of something they didn't understand, something older than the Emperor himself, and the gatekeepers at the far end of the arena did not move because they had never been ordered to open the gate while the champion still breathed, and Kraith was still alive, even if only in body. The human walked forward, his footsteps slow and deliberate, like he wasn't walking across sand, but across history itself, his eyes still fixed on the Emperor, who now clutched the edge of his throne as if it might carry him away from what was coming. Kraith lifted his gaze, his voice barely above a breath, but strong enough to make the arena listen. "You knew he would come," he said, not to the crowd, not to the Emperor, but to the past itself. "You felt the bloodline breathing in the dark, you saw it in the stars, and still you said nothing." The Emperor shouted again, this time calling for his elite guard, the Crimson Fang. 12 warriors trained in silence and death, each one faster than the last, each one deadlier than the one before. And they leapt from the shadows like blades wrapped in smoke, their eyes glowing, their swords humming with energy meant to slice through steel and bone alike. The human did not stop, he did not run, he did not reach for a weapon, because he had none. Instead he raised one hand slowly, palm open toward the sky, and for a second, nothing happened, nothing at all. Then the ground began to hum, softly like a beast, purring in its sleep. The Crimson Fang charged without hesitation, their blades drawn, their feet leaving no prints in the sand, and just before they reached him, the air cracked like glass and the sand exploded upward in a circle around the human, like something had just woken beneath his feet. Blue light surged from the ground, ancient and wild, the mark on his back pulsing brighter and brighter, until it lit the entire arena like a second sun. And when the sand cleared the crimson, Fang were no longer standing, they were on their knees. Weapons dropped, eyes wide, with something that looked like memory. Kraith stared in disbelief, not at the human, but at the light, because he had seen it once long ago in a forbidden's ruin beneath a dying moon, a place where machines whispered in dead languages and walls were carved with the same glowing lines. Same marks now shining from the human skin. The crowd began to murmur, not with laughter, not with fear, but with awe, as if they were watching the return of something holy, something divine. And even the Emperor staggered back into his throne, unable to speak as the arena walls trembled under the growing hum of energy. "Who are you?" he finally shouted, his voice cracking with rage and terror. "What are you?" And the human finally answered, his voice as calm as the wind. "Before a storm, I am the last promise you tried to erase. I am the echo of the bloodline you feared. I am the truth you buried and the memory you cannot kill." And with those words the gates of the arena shook, not from outside force, but from resonance, something inside them, responding to the mark on the human's back, something old and locked and waiting to be called again. Kraith stood slowly, his voice no longer shaking, his posture no longer broken, but steady as a mountain weathered by centuries. He faced the crowd and raised his fist, not in anger, not in threat, but in allegiance. And the crowd roared back, not with screams of war, but with something more dangerous, hope. The Emperor shouted again, his voice rising in pitch as he called for more guards, more weapons, more silence. But it was already too late, because the whisper had shaken more than just a champion. It had shaken the foundation of an empire, and now every eye in the arena no longer looked to the Emperor for strength, they looked at the human. And the human finally turned fully toward the Emperor, his eyes glowing with blue fire, and spoke one more sentence, not loud, not angry, but final. "Your arena has fallen, and your lies will fall with it." The air inside the arena felt heavier now, as if the very walls were leaning and listening, holding their breath, waiting for the next word to fall from the human's mouth, like it was a blade that could cut through steel and memory alike. The Emperor gripped the arms of his throne so tightly that his claws cracked into the black stone, his eyes darting across the silent crowd, across the trembling guards, across the glow still burning on the human's back. But nothing gave him comfort now, because nothing was in his control anymore. Kraith stood beside the human, now no longer a champion, no longer a beast of war, but a figure reborn. His axe still strapped to his back, but his hands were open, not for battle, but for truth, and even the blood on his skin seemed to dry under the light of the human's presence. The Emperor screamed again, his voice breaking, like old glass calling for reinforcements, for warships, for silence. But the comes didn't answer. The arena gates didn't move. The sky above had darkened, and somewhere in the clouds machines that hadn't flown in generations had begun to stir. The human raised his hand again, and the light from the mark on his back pulsed brighter with it, and the sands around his feet began to shift, forming slow circles like tides around a still moon, and deep beneath them, something responded, something ancient, something angry, something awake. The crowd watched in frozen awe, many standing now, without realizing it, their bodies pulled forward, by curiosity, by fear, by something they couldn't name but felt in their bones like gravity, changing direction like the ground preparing to vanish beneath them. Kraith looked at the Emperor, then back at the human, then spoke again, his voice low and broken by truth. "I was there when your kind was betrayed. I was there when the first humans fell, not by war, but by orders whispered in the dark, and I did nothing. I let it happen, and I became your beast, your killer, your slave." The emperor shouted, "Liar, traitor, fool," but his voice was drowned out by the sound of cracking stone as the floor of the arena began to split along the glowing lines. The human had awakened, the markings stretching out like veins of fire through the sand, through the walls, through the very soul of the place. The human turned to Kraith, his voice still calm, still steady. "Do you remember what they were called, before they were erased, before they were twisted into myths, before your emperor renamed them to make himself feel safe?" Kraith nodded slowly, shame deep in his eyes. "They were the makers." He said they were the ones who shaped the stars with words and walked among the void without ships, and one of them spared my life when I deserved to die, and now I see why. The crowd gasped as the word fell from Kraith's lips. The makers, a name forbidden for centuries, a name that had been wiped from history by fire and blade and propaganda. And yet here it was rising again in the open like a ghost refusing to stay dead. The emperor backed away from his throne, now stumbling, his many eyes wide, with something that had no name, but every creature recognized as doom. He reached for a hidden panel beside his seat, but the lights flickered and died before his fingers touched it, and a low mechanical hum rose from deep beneath the arena. The ground shook, not violently, but rhythmically, like a heartbeat rising from slumber. The walls shimmered, and the air grew colder, as if time itself had paused to witness what came next. The human walked toward the center of the arena, where the markings converged, where the old stones met the new sands, and with every step he took the arena changed beneath his feet, no longer just a ring of battle, but a place of memory, of awakening, of judgment. Kraith followed without hesitation, his voice rising for all to hear. "I was your champion, but I was never your servant. I fought for blood, because I forgot what truth tasted like, and now I remember, and I will never forget again." The human reached the center and knelt, placing one hand on the glowing stone, and as he did, the hum became a song, low and ancient, and full of sorrow and fury, and the light surged outward, not in a blast but in a wave, touching every wall, every mind, every scar left behind by forgotten wars. The crowd felt it not as pain but as memory, visions flashing in their minds of things they never lived, battles never recorded, voices crying out in languages they didn't understand but felt were their own, as if their blood had stories it had never told. Above them the sky cracked open, not with fire, not with death, but with shapes metallic and vast, rising from hidden layers of the atmosphere. Old ships once buried in time, now responding to the call of the last blood of the makers, the last voice that carried the key. The emperor screamed again, this time not in command but in fear, as he turned to flee, but the path behind him crumbled, the stone turning to ash beneath his steps. The machines had heard him, and they did not forget, and they did not forgive. Kraith looked up at the sky, at the ships, at the machines that flew without fire, and said softly, "They're returning, aren't they?" And the human answered, "Yes, but not for war. Not yet. They return to remember, before they decide who lives and who ends." The crowd began to chant, not in one tongue, not in one voice, but in 100 broken languages that somehow became one, a chant that rose from their hearts, not because they understood, but because they believed that something had changed, and nothing would ever be the same. The emperor collapsed to his knees, not from an attack, but from the weight of what he'd hidden, from what he had broken. He begged, not with pride, but with panic, "Please, I did what I had to. I kept the peace, I protected the throne." And the human stepped toward him, silent again, eyes glowing like twin stars preparing to collapse. "Peace built on ash is not peace," the human said, "and protection through chains is not protection. It is a prison, and you will answer for the lies you carved into history with fire and steel and silence." And with that the machines above began to descend, slowly surrounding the arena with soft light and low songs like mourning wrapped in metal, and the champion who had once broken worlds, now stood beside the human, not as a fighter, but as a witness to the beginning of the end. The sky above the arena was no longer blue, no longer clear. It was now filled with machines shaped like ancient birds, their wings wide and silent, their bodies pulsing with a light that no one had seen in 1,000 years, and every pair of eyes below stared upward in silence, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, something ancient, something they could feel but not explain. The human stood beneath them with the light on his back, glowing brighter with each second, his mark pulsing in rhythm, with the song humming from the ships above and the ground below, and even the stones in the Emperor's throne began to hum as if they too remembered what they once were. The Emperor trembled, his hands shaking, his voice caught in his throat as he looked around at the arena that no longer obeyed him, at the people who no longer listened, at the machines in the sky that were not his and never were, because he had stolen their silence but never earned their loyalty. He pointed a trembling claw at the human, his voice a broken whisper. "What are you? Why are you here? Who woke you?" And the human stepped forward, his shadow stretching behind him longer than his form, as if the arena itself reached with him, and his voice came low and sharp like thunder held tight beneath water. "You buried the truth beneath blood and stone. You locked the past away with fire and lies and silence. But the past never dies. It only waits, and now it remembers, and now it breathes. And now it speaks through me." Kraith stood beside him, tall, strong, and no longer the Emperor's weapon, but a witness to something greater than war, greater than power, greater than fear. And he raised his voice to the crowd that still stood frozen in their places, and he said, loud and clear, "The Makers are not myths, they are not forgotten. They are not lost, because one stands before us now, and we must choose who we are when truth stands in front of us." The crowd murmured, voices rising and falling like waves, crashing against the edges of the past they had never known, and in that chaos some wept and some shouted, and some dropped to their knees because their bones remembered what their minds could not. And the song in the sky grew louder like a storm, warming up like justice drawing breath. The human turned and pointed to the ground where the glowing lines formed a circle, now a seal broken and opened by his touch, and from it rose a pillar of crystal clear and humming with power, and inside that crystal floated something small, something impossible, something that made the Emperor scream without sound. Inside was a sphere of light, and inside that light was a memory frozen in time, a recording of the day the Makers were betrayed, not in battle, not by invasion, but by treachery from within, and the image showed the Emperor's face, younger, colder, crowned in lies, and standing over the bodies of those who once called him brother. The truth spilled into the arena, not as a story, not as a rumor, but as a vision, a fact, a moment carved into time, and no one could deny it, no one could unsee it, and no one could unhear the screams of the ones who died trusting the wrong voice. The Emperor fell backward, crawling away from the crystal, begging not for mercy, but for silence. "No, no, this is a trick, this is a lie. I saved this galaxy, I stopped the wars, I brought peace." And the human stepped toward him again, each step ringing like a hammer in the bones of the arena. "You brought obedience, you brought silence, but you never brought peace. You erased voices. You shattered hope, and you built your throne on the ashes of those who gave you their hearts. And now you will answer, not to me but to them." Kraith looked to the crystal, then to the sky, then to the people watching, and his voice was steady, his eyes clear. "I was blind. I was used, but no more. If the Makers rise, I will stand with them. If truth returns, I will walk beside it, and if justice demands my life, I will offer it without question." The ships above opened their hulls slowly, and figures descended, not machines, not soldiers, but constructs shaped from memory, shaped from the stars. themselves their forms glowing and shifting like light held in glass, and they landed without a sound, standing in a perfect circle around the arena, as if sealing it from time itself. One of them stepped forward, its voice neither male nor female, but pure a sound that echoed inside minds instead of ears, and it said, "The trial begins, now the truth is present. The accused is alive, the witness is ready, and the judgment will be made by the one who carries the mark of the first flame." The humans stepped into the center of the glowing circle, the machines bowing their heads, slightly not in worship but in recognition, and the crystal pulsed once more, revealing more memories, more voices, more faces of those who were lost, and their words wrapped around the arena like wind, like breath, like prophecy. The Emperor screamed again, trying to run, but the ground beneath him rose, forming walls of light that held him in place, and the crowd watched as the lies they had lived under began to crumble, like old bones crushed beneath the weight of what was real. The human lifted his hand, and the mark on his back flared with a final burst of light, and he spoke clearly so all could hear. "This is not revenge. This is remembrance. This is not destruction. This is correction. The galaxy was twisted by fear, but it will be rebuilt by truth." The machines raised their arms, and beams of light shot into the sky, not as weapons, but as signals reaching into the void, calling others, calling more vessels, more memories, more witnesses, because this was not the end of something. This was only the beginning of everything the Emperor had tried to bury. And Kraith stepped forward to stand beside the human once more, and he said to the crowd, "We were made to forget, but we will never forget again. We were made to kneel, but we will stand now, and forever beside the ones who carry the truth through fire and silence and stars." The arena glowed brighter than any sun, the machines singing louder than any battle ever fought, and deep in the galaxy, the stars themselves seemed to shimmer with memory and light and promise, and far above, watching through the eyes of satellites, ancient forces turned their gaze toward the one who had awakened what should never have slept. The crystal in the heart of the arena continued to spin slowly, its light reaching into the corners of every watcher's soul, and what had once been a place for blood and screams had become something else, something sacred, something terrifyingly alive. The sky above was filled with silent ships, ancient and gleaming like sleeping gods now awakened and watching the circle of constructs, standing guard around the human, their forms flickering like memories caught between light and shadow as the past breathed into the present. The Emperor knelt behind his glowing cage, his eyes wide with madness and fear, his claws trembling against the floor that no longer obeyed him. His voice now a whisper, muttering broken words from a language too old to matter to a world that no longer listened. The crowd stood as one, not cheering, not crying, just watching, waiting, holding their breath as the human turned slowly, his eyes passing over every soul like fire scanning paper, and every heart that met his gaze felt something rise, something stir, something ancient, something rebellious. Kraith looked out toward the stands, his voice loud and steady, no longer the voice of a warrior, but of a witness. This arena was built on blood, it was fed by fear, it was ruled by lies, and today those lies are broken, and the blood will speak for itself. The crowd began to shift, murmurs moving like waves through the tiers of stone, some dropping to their knees, others raising fists high into the air, as if answering a call they had never heard before, but somehow always known, and from behind them came more sounds, more voices, more footsteps. The outer gates of the arena burst open, not with violence, but with force, and through them came those who had waited in silence for generations. Survivors, refugees, the forgotten, the erased, their clothes torn, their eyes glowing with the same fire that burned on the human's back, They were humans, but not like any the crowd had seen, their bodies marked by starlight, their skin tattooed in glowing symbols, their hands sparking with the energy of machines that answered only to them, and at their lead marched a woman with silver hair and eyes like twin comets. She reached the center and bowed once to the human, placing her hand over her chest, and her voice sang like steel drawn from an ancient sheath. "We heard your call, we followed your light across stars that tried to kill us, and we bring with us the last truth of the makers, the seed of what was and what will be again." The human nodded slowly, his voice low but sharp enough to cut the silence. "We are not here to burn. We are here to build, but what was taken must be returned, and what was silenced must speak, and what was buried must rise." The construct surrounding them lifted their arms as the machines above opened like blooming flowers, and from within dropped canisters, pods, orbs, made of glowing metal that struck the sand without sound and split open, revealing tools, maps, data, and fragments of cities long lost to history. "The machines are giving it back," Kraith whispered. "They are giving back what was stolen, what was buried, what we were never meant to see." And the Emperor screamed from behind his cage, his words twisted with rage and madness. "You fools, you don't understand. They will burn everything. They will erase us all, and I was the only thing holding them back." The woman turned to him, her voice colder than space and stronger than gravity. "We were never the storm you feared. We were the light you tried to smother, and now that light stands above you. And you are no longer a ruler. You are only a relic." The Emperor lunged forward, striking the cage with a roar, but the barrier pulsed and threw him backward, his body shaking, his eyes rolling as he tried to stand again and again, only to fall like dust caught in the wind of time. The human raised his hand, and from the ground beneath the arena, more structures began to rise, towers, walkways, beams of light forming paths that led into the earth, like the bones of a sleeping city waking from its grave. And the crowd gasped as they saw the true shape of the arena for the first time, not a circle but a keyhole, not a prison but a door. The woman stepped beside the human and spoke to the crowd, her voice rising with power and promise. This was never meant to be a place of death. This was meant to be the gate through which the next world would walk, and now that gate is open, and what you do next will decide whether you are part of that world or lost to it. The crowd roared now, not in rage but in unity, in truth and rebellion, and across the stands, beings began to rise in defiance, soldiers dropping their weapons, prisoners breaking their chains, children pulling off the masks forced on them by fear and lies, and all of them moved toward the center. The rebellion did not begin with fire, it began with memory, with truth, with voices saying no more. And as the machines continued to build rising bridges between sand and sky, the ground itself began to shake, not with war, but with awakening. In the distant cities turned their lights toward the arena, blinking in sequences they had never used before, signals pulsing through the air like forgotten messages remembered by broken towers and old satellites and ships, long buried beneath oceans and moons. Kraith stood at the edge of the rising floor, watching it all happen, his chest heavy with emotion, and he whispered to himself, "This is what it feels like to be free." And the human beside him turned his head and said, "Not free yet, but finally awake." The Emperor's cage lowered slowly, sinking into the sand, as if the ground itself had decided to erase him. And his screams grew fainter until they vanished into the hum of machines and the chant of people, calling not for blood, but for truth, for future, for flame. And as the last piece of the arena floor clicked into place, the light from the sky met the glow from the earth and formed a pillar, so bright it reached the edge of the atmosphere and lit up every shadow that had tried to hide the truth. And The human looked up at that light with quiet eyes and steady hands, and whispered not to the people, not to the machines, but to the stars. Themselves we are coming back, and we are not afraid. The sky above the arena had turned silver as if the stars themselves had stepped closer. The ships of the Makers hovered in silence like sentinels from forgotten time, and beneath them, the people of the galaxy stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the one who had awakened everything with a whisper and a memory. The human stood in the center of the great circle, his body still, his breath calm as mark, burning brighter with every heartbeat, like it was drawing energy from the crowd, from the ships, from the broken stones of the past, infusing them all into something new, something unstoppable. Kraith stood beside him, no longer the bone breaker, no longer the champion of the Emperor, now just a warrior who had seen truth and chosen to stand with it, his body a wall, his spirit ready to fall again if needed. But not for the Empire, for something far older, far purer. The crystal that had shown the betrayal still hovered in the air, spinning slowly above the platform, and inside it the frozen image of the Emperor, younger, crowned in deceit, his hands stained in the blood of those who trusted him, his eyes cold with the weight of lies too heavy to carry anymore. From the sands rose more survivors, their faces marked by history, their hands raised not in surrender but in oath, and they formed a circle around the human and Kraith, around the constructs, around the glowing core of the earth, now exposed like the beating heart of something divine. The Emperor still sat in silence, his throne half sunk in the sand, his words gone, his eyes dull, like a king who had outlived the age he forged and now had no place to rule, no mouth to lie, no hands to strike, number crown to wear. The human raised his hand once more, and the machines responded like old friends, long separated and now returned. They lowered cables and beams and crystal pillars around the circle, and from each one flowed a light, not of war but of creation, blue and gold and silver, forming shapes that pulsed like breath, like hope, like memory. This is not the end, the human said, his voice low but clear. This is the beginning, this is the seed we were never allowed to plant. This is the truth we were told to forget. This is the fire we carry, now and forever, and no one will bury it again. Kraith turned to the crowd, his arms wide, his voice deep and strong. We are the ones who watched in silence while they twisted our stories. We are the ones who forgot who we were, and now we remember, and now we rise not for war, but for truth, and for the light that never kneels. The ships above began to shift, their hulls glowing in response to the words, and one by one, they sent down more memory cores, more fragments of a history burned away, and each one was caught by the constructs who laid them carefully across the sand, forming a pattern, a map, a key to the future written in the blood of the past. The crowd gasped as they saw it form, a symbol so old it burned inside them, without names, a shape that lived in the roots of every story, every myth, every forbidden whisper. The symbol of the Makers, the symbol of unity, the symbol of the first fire. The woman with silver hair stepped forward, holding a staff carved from crystal and bone, her eyes shining with tears and power, and she spoke to all who could hear across stars and steel. This fire was never meant to destroy, it was meant to guide. And now that it burns again, we offer a choice to every world, to every people, to every soul: either step forward into the light, or be left behind in the dust of lies. The crowd responded with a roar, a sound that echoed across the arena, into the sky, into the stars, into the ships still watching from orbit and across the galaxy. Satellites and vessels and stations caught the sound and sent it further, until even the edge systems could feel the ground shifting. The Emperor rose slowly, his body broken, but his voice found one last scream: you don't understand, you will bring chaos. You will burn everything we built. And the human turned to him, his eyes calm, his voice like wind over fire. What you built was never peace, it was silence. And silence is not life, it is death waiting. And we choose life now, even if it means burning away your throne. The crystal above them pulsed once more, and then shattered, not in violence, but in release, and the fragments scattered into the air like dust caught in starlight, and where they fell, flowers grew, flowers that glowed with the same energy as the machines, as the ships, as the mark on the human's back. The throne cracked and crumbled, and the sand swallowed what was left of the emperor, and no one cried, and no one ran, and no one looked away. They only watched as the old world was taken by the ground that now answered to truth, not power. The human looked around at every face, at every voice, at every soul, and he whispered a final sentence, not to command, but to anchor this moment in time. We were never meant to kneel, we were meant to rise, and now that we stand together, nothing can silence us again. And with that, the machines lifted the circle of light into the air, not as a weapon, but as a beacon, and it hovered above the arena, casting its glow over the galaxy, like a promise that could never be broken again. And deep inside every heart, a fire took root, not one of rage, but of awakening. Kraith placed a hand on the human's shoulder, and spoke only once, "Thank you," and the human nodded without speaking, because words were no longer needed, because the truth had already been spoken, and now it was time to live it, far beyond the system. On the edge of deep space, more ships stirred, ancient stations flickered, alive ruins blinked in recognition, and across 1,000 worlds, people turned their eyes toward the light above the arena, and knew something had changed forever. The Makers had returned, not as gods, but as memory, not as rulers, but as truth, not to destroy, but to remind. And those who walked in their light were no longer afraid, because fear only lives in silence, and the silence had finally ended. And the fire in the sky burned brighter than ever, not to blind, but to guide, and the human watched it with quiet eyes, knowing this was not his story alone. It belonged to all of them, to the blood, to the bones, to the stars, and to the light that never kneels. Truth is out. The stars remember. Subscribe now, and never miss the next story that changes everything. If you believe humanity always finds a way, subscribe for more HFY sci-fi stories that prove it.
So,